news articles. I'm going to try to hold the phone steady. It's hard to hold the phone doing a live stream, but I'm going to try to hold the phone steady. So, this is the Toronto Star news article. There was an Indian Canadian doctor in Toronto who was uh, molesting unconscious hospital patients. Dr. George Dudnot was an anesthesiologist. And while Americans and Canadians, let me first say that Toronto is the biggest tourist city in all of Canada. Toronto is probably the most famous next to Vancouver. Vancouver, Toronto are famous cities in Canada. And when Americans visit Canada, they usually will visit Toronto or they'll visit Vancouver. So Toronto is not just gets Canadians. Toronto gets lots of American tourists and people from around the world. And when those American tourists need medical attention, they would probably have ended up at the hospital in which Indian doctor, convicted doctor rapist, Dr. George Dudnot works at. And Dr. George Dudnot, the Indian Canadian doctor from Toronto, was also purposely giving patients HIV. He was intentionally infecting patients with HIV, which could have included American patients because Dr. George Dudnot was an anesthesiologist. And so most victims had no idea that they were even raped or given HIV because Dr. George Dudnot was an anesthesiologist and he would sedate the patients prior to surgery and then he would rape them prior to surgery and then give them HIV. So there's a lot of people who were probably victims of Dr. George Dudnot and don't even know it because they were sedated, they were unconscious, and they were under anesthesiology. And most victims who are sedated and unconscious don't remember a thing. So there's probably a lot more victims of this Indian doctor from Toronto. And there could be a major HIV outbreak in the United States. There could be a major HIV outbreak in the United States, and Americans don't even realize that they were given HIV by this Toronto doctor, this Indian Canadian doctor, Dr. George Dudnot, right? And, Americans, especially American tourists who were visiting Toronto, if American tourists who were visiting Toronto needed medical attention, they probably would have ended up at this hospital, which, by the way, it even says in the news articles that the hospital engaged in a cover-up, which means that the nurses knew that Dr. George Dudnot was raping the patients. The security guards knew that Dr. George Dudnot was raping the patients, right? So there was a big cover-up in the hospital. And so a lot of people were purposely infected with HIV. And this Indian doctor, Dr. George Dudnot, was not only raping unconscious patients, but he was also giving them HIV. And what Americans don't know is that he also did it to American patients because that hospital, which Dr. George Dudnot works at, they get lots of American tourists. Toronto is one of the most famous cities in Canada, which gets a lot of tourists, especially a lot of people from America. And American tourists who needed medical attention would have ended up at that Toronto hospital, and American patients, while they were sedated under anesthesiology, while they were unconscious prior to surgery, while American patients were sedated unconscious, American patients may not even realize because they were sedated and unconscious that while they were unconscious, they were given HIV and raped by this Indian doctor, Dr. George Dudnot. So, Americans, you should consider starting a class action lawsuit against Canada and against this Indian doctor who was purposely molesting patients and giving them HIV while they were under anesthesiology. So we could pull up an article. See, it says, hold on, it's an advertisement. Is it not going to let me pull the article up? Come on, Toronto Star. Please let me read the article. Oh. Okay. What is... Can I not read the article, Toronto Star? Anyways. There you go. The hospital engaged in the cover-up. Let's go really fast. Okay. Anyways, you get the... There you go. Doctor... Oh. Okay, anyways. So, let's go back to the other page so that... Okay. So, as you can see, there's lots of news articles about this. But see, there was a cover-up in Canada. They even admit the hospital engaged in a cover-up. And the Canadian government covered up the fact that Dr. George Dudnot could have raped and purposely given HIV to many American tourists who were American patients when they were visiting Toronto. Because, like when American tourists visit Toronto, there could be many things that happen. Like an American tourist could have got mugged and robbed in Toronto, beaten up. And then if that American tourist suddenly needed medical attention, they would end up as a patient. They would become an American patient at the Canadian hospital where Dr. George Dudnot worked. And they could have been given HIV and molested and raped and given HIV while they were under anesthesiology, while they were unconscious, sedated prior to surgery. And these American patients, these American tourists, might not even realize that they were given HIV by this Indian Canadian doctor from Toronto who was purposely giving patients HIV, and he was raping them while they were unconscious, sedated prior to surgery, because Dr. George Dudnot was an anesthesiologist. He was responsible for sedating the patients, but he wasn't supposed to rape them and give them HIV. So Americans, you should consider starting a class action lawsuit against Canada and against the hospital and especially against the Canadian government for covering this up and for not warning Americans that there could be a major HIV outbreak and that they might have been given HIV by this Indian Toronto doctor who was purposely assaulting patients and then giving them HIV. So Americans, you should consider doing a class action lawsuit against Canada and Dr. George Dudnot and against the Toronto hospital that engaged in the cover-up. So